Good morning, class. I hope you're all doing well. Well, this is the voiceover that I had promised. I also want you to know that I posted a PDF version of this presentation, all three presentations from the last weekend that you'll find under the Files tab. So anyway, here we are. I'm going to go over this presentation with you. I would ask you to keep in mind that some of these things will require the topics that we're talking about will require more of an explanation that we would normally have had in the classroom. Therefore, I would ask you to take some notes, and if you can identify anything that you would like to discuss further, please jot them all down, and I'll be sure to do a review when we have our next class. So anyway, as I would have done in person if you were in the classroom, is reiterate some of the topics that we would be discussing. When we look at our learning objectives, there are two that come up. First is develop an understanding of logistical supply chains and the impact of disruptions, and then to become familiar with the many drivers which help define the characteristics of trade in any country. So we're going to talk about these. Again, for our next class, I would ask you to bring your article that you would want to discuss. And then in this class here, we'll be talking about multinational corporations, foreign direct investment, franchising, governing bodies, and an introduction to supply chains. But before we do that, let's take just a second, as we customarily do, to review. I keep bringing this slide up because I think it's probably one of the most important ones in the entire course, because it points out in four categories: commercial risk, currency risk, cross-cultural risk, and country risk. Each one of these things, if you were to be doing a map of your distribution channels and your global business, should be looked at very carefully in an effort to identify some that could surprisingly appear and become a showstopper to your business. So again, I would ask you to make sure you keep this thing handy. It's very important. As a review, we talked about logistics. No need to go into this in any further detail. However, I should say that the efficiency that exists in your logistics operation will ensure the smooth connection between the different nodes of the supply chain so that you have an uninterrupted supply of goods to your customers, and at the same time have an uninterrupted flow of cash and information to you from your customers. Again, logistics is defined as the efficient forward and reverse flow of raw materials, money, finished goods, services, and related information from point of origin to point of consumption. So again, the reverse flow could be not only materials that you're doing, so you're not deadheading or shipping a vessel empty, but it could also be the flow of information or reimbursement. And again, in supply chain management, one of the most important things is an integrative approach and efficiency with the enforcement of driving components to make sure that these are all connected. And again, you might not be doing this in your occupations right now, but if you do, and if you end up in a supply chain type of a position, it's going to be very important that you understand these connections. And each one of the connections will have certain types of time frames and parameters that need to be adhered to in order to ensure a smooth flow of goods and also materials. So as we look at global business, now we're talking, now we're into this lecture for this weekend, last weekend. We talk about the globalization of markets. And sometimes it's referred to as glocalization because it's a global initiative, but it's dealing with the local population of the country that you are dealing with. Some of the companies that have done very well with this are Coca-Cola, Starbucks, Citigroup, McDonald's, and even IKEA Furniture. These guys have done a great job of penetrating the markets throughout the world. It's important to point out too that the ingredients for Coca-Cola and Starbucks and McDonald's may be different in different countries. For example, in South America, the Coca-Cola is sweeter. Starbucks, well, depending upon where they get their beans, it might be entirely a different taste in Africa. And then McDonald's, and I think I brought this up in class, depending upon where you are, for example, you wouldn't be selling beef in India in a Big Mac. You would be selling the Maharaja burger, which is made from lamb, because religious beliefs dictate that you do not eat the cow, which is considered to be the mother of all things and very sacred. So in this lecture, we want to speak to the topics of, why would you go global? Well, of course, one of the biggest, I think this is the biggest factor, is labor costs and availability and land costs. These two here are margin builders that many CFOs and CEOs seek to plug into their businesses to create greater margins and more profit. Or it could be raw material availability. There may be a place where minerals are bountiful, or certain products such as rubber trees or coffee are readily available, more so than you would find in other parts of the world. Or but perhaps there's a skill that's not present in your country. So for example, IT, that's really, India is a breeding ground for excellent IT people. Now, direct foreign investment, it has always flourished over the years. And here is a look at some of the many companies that have invested across the different parts of the world. In order to be a direct foreign investment corporation, it means that you are present in 2 or more countries. So obviously you can see some of the big players: General Motors, Siemens, Bosch, IKEA, Samsung, so on and so forth. So this is the category of those companies that invest in different parts of the world. Sometimes these are referred to as a multinational corporation, meaning that it is a corporation that is registered in more than one country, or that has operations in more than one country. It is usually a large corporation which both produces and sells goods or services in various companies. Now, I think I mentioned this in another class, and that is often these corporations, because they're so huge and employ so many and add so much to the tax base for a country, they often develop a tremendous amount of political power and influence within the countries in which they reside. Even in the United States, Disneyland and Disney World have been extremely powerful in terms of legislation that they have to adhere to in the state of Florida or California. But now, because of the war, there are more and more companies reducing exposure in Russia. And here's a list of many of them that have pulled out as a sign of retaliation for Putin's activities attacking Russia. Ukraine. So if you were doing business with these people, what would happen to your supply chain? That's why there's potential problems. That's why mapping of a supply chain is very important. And that's why contingency planning is very important when you're looking at your different types of connections throughout the world. Because at any minute, there could be political strife or a decline in their currency value or any number of things. Now we're going to talk for a minute about how companies spread their exposure. So for example, here is a Coca-Cola distributor. He could be anywhere in the world, but he's working or she is working under a licensing agreement. So therefore, it's a contract between a couple of parties. These are referred to as the licensor and the licensee, in which the licensor grants the licensee the right to use the brand name, trademark, patented technology, or the ability to produce and sell goods by the licensor. So that means if I wanted to be a bottler in Argentina, I would apply to Coca-Cola to see if I could get a licensing agreement so that I could be the distributor in Argentina. Now, the thing is that when you become a licensee, there are certain requirements that you must adhere to in order to stay in business. Just like in my case, Honda dealers. Honda dealers had to buy parts from us. They had to buy cars from us. They had to build facilities that met our requirements, so on and so forth. And if at any time they accumulated enough demerits in terms of doing these things, we could possibly cancel them or get them a new buyer. So a licensing agreement is, you know, when Coca-Cola doesn't want to set up a plant in the country, they license somebody else to do the work. Surely Nike, they identify suppliers, and the suppliers are licensed to make Nike athletic and leisure wear. McDonald's, it's also possible to get a franchise. And that is, it's something that's it's granted to an individual or a company, the franchisee, the right to run a business selling a product or service under the franchisor's successful business model and identified by the franchisor's trademark or brand, similar to what I just talked about with Honda. And again, even though this McDonald's might be in China, they still have to adhere to certain McDonald's standards in terms of facility appearance and the way the business is operated and the way it's accounted for. But also they have the latitude to address the requirements of customers in their locale. So, you know, when I was in Japan, well, many times, but when I was there, I would go to a McDonald's looking for a hamburger and wind up with a cuttlefish sandwich. These are the kind of things that you would see. They're not in violation of agreement, but also a requirement to meet the needs of customers in that country for which you granted the franchise to. Also, there's outsourcing. That is, if you do not want to manufacture something yourself, you're going to be hiring people outside the company to assemble part of or build an entire product. The main reason why companies choose to do this is to cut costs. And labor is among any company's largest cost. And this is probably a sweatshop in Vietnam. These sneakers, and I'm going to introduce you later on to a NGO called Team Sweat, where their president went to another country to see how these things operate. And it's very, very enlightening. Also, there are things known as joint ventures. So if you look over here, you'll see the Coca-Cola Company and Procter Gamble. And Gamble, who's been around forever, that's a $4.2 billion joint venture to use Coca-Cola's distribution system to increase the reach for the Procter & Gamble products, Pringles and Sunny Delight. BMW and Toyota formed an alliance on certain drivetrain components. Joint ventures are usually formed by two businesses, and they have complementary strengths. For example, a technology company may create a partnership with a marketing company to bring an innovative product to market. And then there are some that start out with high hopes and become disasters. And this is a case with Daimler, this is Mercedes-Benz, and Chrysler. So these are usually formed by two businesses with complementary strengths. For example, a technology company, well, they may create a partnership with a marketing company to bring an innovative product to market. Now, in this case with Chrysler and Daimler, Chrysler was very profitable, and it was a engineering-driven company, and it had its own unique culture, kind of place where people never wore ties. Upper management was on first name basis with workers, so on and so forth. Daimler felt if they merged with Chrysler, they could take advantage of their engineering prowess and also use their assembly lines to share platforms for different models that might be on the horizon for Daimler. But there was one big problem, and we'll talk about this later when we get to the culture part of this course. The Germans were entirely different people than these Americans. Their work habits were different. Their attire was coat and tie every day. They felt that they were superior to the Chrysler people. And then, as in most cases, they never really looked into the details further because they found out later that the information systems wouldn't merge properly, that some of the tooling was inappropriate for Mercedes and likewise for Chrysler. So the whole business was a multi-billion-dollar failure. And this is heralded in this book. Sorry for the poor picture, Taken for a Ride, which contrasts these two CEOs. One was Bob Eaton from Chrysler, a very innocent, almost Boy Scout type, and Jürgen Schrimp, an arrogant German executive whose whole mode, even at the initial birth of this alliance, was to take over Chrysler completely. So this is a disaster, and maybe something that you want to consider for a paper, because it's very robust with content. So also there are other kind of lightweight, I call them strategic alliances light. These are agreements between independent companies who cooperate in the manufacturing, development, or sale of products and services. So for example, Starbucks and United Airlines, United Airlines began selling Starbucks products. So think about the advertising exposure with a large number of passengers that would be partaking of Starbucks, many of which would be for the first time. So maybe they would become a conquest sale. So now we're going to talk about countries and how you're measuring economic performance with them. So for example, this is GNP and there's GDP. So let's go to GDP first. And that's the total value of output of goods and services produced within an economy in a given period of time. So again, that's how you measure the output of their goods and services, not just goods. Now, the other measurement is GNP. So you take a company like, well, here's some examples like Ford or British Petroleum or BMW. These companies produce tremendous revenue in the United States, but they also produce products overseas. So a measurement of their overall prowess is gross national product, which combines what they do in the United States or any home country and what they do abroad. Now, there's another measurement, and that is GDP per person in any country, which can give you a good idea whether or not they're poor or rich. So for example, China has a tremendous amount of output, but it rarely affects the individual who in many cases are living a lower standard of life. So having said that, let's look at some of the countries that trade a lot. Now look, this graph I made about a year ago, and it probably is not relevant now, but it showcases the huge amount of trade that goes on in foreign exchange transactions. If you go to look this up, you'll get some current numbers, but they're very hard to get your hands on. However, when you break the big players down, you're talking about the United States, China, Japan, and Germany. And these regions are broken out, as you see over on the right: Africa, Australia, miscellaneous countries, Latin American and Caribbean, Middle East, Europe, Asia, and North America. So irrespective of where these markets are, the biggest players you'll see right here. And then you'll see a breakdown of the different countries. Now, knowing these countries reside in these certain segments of this pie chart, you could go into Global Edge, which is, available to you, and find out specifics about their output and their economies. But it's an $80 trillion world economy. Without global trade, you wouldn't have these kind of results. The top 15 countries are listed here. This little tiny country of Luxembourg has the hugest GDP per capita, but these two are experts in banking, and even Ireland. You can see the United States down around here that is an amalgamation of different types of sources of income. If you look at the global economic period, and that word per capita comes up, the top tier is $20,000 per person and approximately 1 billion people. And then the second tier is 2,000 to 20,000, and the base is 2,000. You can see a lot of the global economy has many, many poor people. Of course, some of them are countries that are emerging, but again, there's other countries that are undeveloped completely. So anyway, we're talking about these terms here is gross domestic product and gross national income. Now, this BRIC are the ones that, again, these are emerging market big players. And I just read the other day that, let me get this, Iran and Argentina have applied to be members of this BRIC that comprises a tremendous amount of trade in the emerging markets of the world. And they are China, India, Brazil, Russia. And if Iran and Argentina come on board, again, this would add to it. So we'll talk about emerging markets. An emerging market economy is the economy of a developing nation that is becoming more engaged with global markets as it grows. They've become players. Now, they represent 48% of world trade, 60% of foreign direct investment inflow, that means goods being brought into their country. Certainly they're not mercantilists, and 40% of FDI outflow. Now, to characterize them, these are the things that put them in this slot: lower than average per capita income, brisk economic growth, high volatility, some instability in a number of ways, in infrastructure or currency swings, but they do have growth potential. And if you're looking at world manufacturing output, you can look at Europe and you can look at the US. But the two big players are the European Union, 27 members right now, and it looks like Ukraine has applied for membership, and I think it's been granted, but it takes a while to get these gears in motion so they become a full bona fide member. And then you have Mexico, the United States, and Canada in the North American Trade Agreement. So that brings us to the topic of importing and exporting. What is healthy? Well, you don't want a trade deficit. And you could have a trade surplus. So I don't know what the best balance between the two if you put them on a seesaw, but it's healthy to not be in a position where you're buying everything that you could possibly make yourself from another country, such as China. Now, tariffs have a lot to do with things, and you can look from 1950 to 2019. I do not have current numbers, they weren't published. But you can see, like, for example, France in 1950 had 5.9%. Now it's 1.8. Great Britain was at 23%. Now it's 2.7. US was at 14, now it's 2.0. Italy, 1.84, 1.84, 1.84. Why the same? Well, they're European Union countries, and they have an agreement. However, do not be fooled by these low numbers, because if you were to take the time to go into the tariff tables for any of these countries, you would find all these different commodities and things listed, and then you would find the tariff for each one. And it's, in many cases, it's not a pretty picture, like 24% on this or 10% on that, 15 on this, because they don't want these products brought into their country. But the stated tariffs, as you see here, are as they are listed. Now, the thing is, if you were to go into another country and want to export goods to them, one of the things you would want to look at is look at their tariff tables to make sure that you understand what's going to be taxed when you bring these things into their country. So again, top trading powers, well, it's, partners, it stands the region: Canada, Mexico, China, Japan. These are way up there. However, as I mentioned many times in this course so far, tariffs can be used as a weapon. So, for example, Trump always had a certain amount of animosity for China because he wanted to make America great again through manufacturing. But what he did is he put a 25% tariff on $250 billion worth of goods from China. Now, of course, China would have to make a choice: raise the prices of goods to compensate for that, or to eat it. So again, I don't know what percentage was eaten and what percentage the prices were raised or the prices stayed the same. But it was a very vindictive effort on the part of Trump to do such a thing. And then, of course, when we're talking about trade between countries, depending on what they want to let into your country, there could be tariffs. And remember, when there are tariffs, that money goes directly into the economic systems of that country. So it can increase their coffers. There could be quotas. You're only allowed to send so many bottles of wine to France. There could be embargoes. Well, we don't want anything from you, such as Cuba. There could be boycotts that are retaliation, such as maybe a company that supports, or it's been said that supports abortion, and people are boycotting that company, or protectionism. We just don't want what you sell because they sell the same thing. So placing limits on foreign trade to protect industries and businesses home, as we talked about before, is protectionism. So a protective tariff is imposed on imports to protect domestic products from external competition. The purpose is a cost advantage structure. Importers pay the tax to the US Treasury Department. So when you're looking at a quota, a limit on the amount of goods that can be imported, scarcity in supply increases demand. Government orders a complete ban on products from another country, such as Cuba. That's been that way since the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then again, as I mentioned, boycotts are designed to punish or coerce a change in behavior between norms. I mean, let's face it, aren't the sanctions on Russia a form of a boycott, refusing to do business with them? So anyway, that's it for this session so far. We're going to take a short break and we're going to come back and we're going to go into session number 2. Okay, class, pretend it's Sunday morning and weekend number 3. This is session number 2. And what I would like to do is continue. We talked about tariffs. And again, remember, that's one of the things you would be looking at when you're choosing a country. Of course, along with all those other items that are on the risk page that I keep referring to. So I wanted to talk about the European Union for a minute, because the European Union is 27 democratic European nations, all supposedly working in harmony together. In its simplest sense, before, when you would be in a car going from one country to another, every time you got to a border crossing, you had to go through passport control. But they put something in place called the Schengen Agreement, so that all of the avenues of different countries are now open and travelers can freely drive from one to the other. Their objective was peace, prosperity, and freedom, and a common currency. So you didn't have to worry about exchange rates. We're all using the same thing. Some countries like this, some countries don't. Now, if you want to know more about the European Union, here is a address that you can paste and take a good look. Now, some of the things that they focused on was safer food for countries, joint action on crime and terror, ease of travel between countries, and trade regulations. Right now, the G7, the world's largest economies, and some other countries are meeting right now to talk about Ukraine and Russia and other problems in the world, and hunger. These are all collaborating right now on trying to figure out some course of action to improve conditions throughout the world. Now, the governing bodies, as I mentioned, there's a lot of them, and actually there are more developing as I speak. Trade governing bodies, NAFTA, here's the United States and North America. And you have Mercosur, which is South America with Argentina, Brazil, Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay. These all have their own trade relationships. Central America has their own. You can see all the different countries. And again, every one of these have their own rules. I'll give you an example that's really crazy. We have the North American Free Trade Agreement, right? And we would export some components to our factories in Mexico. Now, normally we would use wooden pallets for the goods, but Mexico felt there was a problem with certain types of bug infections, and they come in with these pallets. So every one had to be fumigated when it came in. Now, do you know what that did to receiving time and put away time? So later we switched to plastic pallets so we wouldn't have to do this anymore. So here's Central America. Another is South Asia, SATA. They all have their own. The European Union that we talked about. And then there's the Central European Union in green. So again, there are different entities. The IDA, for example, that's the International Development Association, and they have their hand in international taxes, duties, licensing, exchange rate control, trade sanctions, and free trade agreements. Your takeaway from this is that there's a large bureaucracy out there. Everybody has their hand in it. And some of the risks that you could run into would be double taxation, paying exorbitant value-added taxes, expropriation, somebody taking your stuff, economic nationalism, or even war. So there are a lot of risk factors that you could run into. And the other thing is a pirateization of the technology of your goods. You know, don't you think that Japan has taken some luxury cars and taken them apart and reverse engineered them to build the Lexus or the Infinity? So anyway, I think that gave you a little bit of a lesson between session number 1 and now. And now we're going to talk about global business and also logistics. Now, the Ames YouTube, I know the assignment was to watch that, and you already did a nice summary of it, but I had planned to show it again because it's a very, very good explanation of how supply chains work. And again, you know, I was going to use it in class and then stop at certain points and discuss it with you. But when you look at a supply chain, you got to remember one thing, that this is the normal layout, but the suppliers are very critical. So suppose you had a supplier, let's just go with the shirts in Bangladesh. Nice Madras shirt like they have in India. Well, they have suppliers that are tier 2 that feed this supplier so they could assemble the good to its finished product and then send it to a manufacturer that would complete everything, put it all together. So there is a tremendous amount of risk with these tier 2 suppliers. One of the things I'm going to show you when we get together at our next meeting is a video of the Honda supplier meeting where we stipulate again and again on-time delivery, quality, and cost down. We call it QCD, quality, cost, and delivery. So again, the synchronization of the tier 2, there could be a tier 3 supplier, tier 2 and tier 1, all have to work together. So when this entity gets all those components, they can put it all together. So again, quality, cost, and delivery are all the things that need to go into the makeup. And this supplier base can make or break the success of any corporation. I'll talk more about that. And then once the goods are made, well, how do they get from the distribution center to the customer? It's got to be efficient. How it is transported, how things go into a trailer, what kind of fuel the trailer burns or the tractor burns. And then finally to the customer. This product from here to here to here, and even here, need to meet all the requirements of a customer. So for example, let's suppose you're getting butter. Well, butter has to be produced to the ultimate and hygienic standards. But at the same time, it's going to go in a refrigeration truck. So refrigeration trucks tend to produce condensation on the exterior of a box. That's why in many cases, when you get butter, you'll see that the cardboard has a laminate on there, so it doesn't get permeated by the moisture if there is any condensation. This is an art and a science in itself. Then you take, for example, the supplier roles. Again, here's a shot probably in Vietnam or Bangladesh. And here is another assembly line. Here's a meat packing place. So it's important to understand that suppliers can have a very important role in the design, collaboration, and the quality of a product. That's why it's important for companies to collaborate with their suppliers so that they can get the best goods and ensure the correct processes so that the product itself is quite excellent. They also can improve efficiency and cost down, either through coercive methods or collaboration, and they need to work with them to incentivize to meet production targets so there are no back orders. So also another important thing is lead time coordination and ordering. What do you think if you had to give a supplier a 120-day lead time to produce the amount of goods that you need? Well, that would mean you would need a 120-day supply of goods in a warehouse. You don't want that. Optimally, the best thing would be lean delivery, in that maybe once a month you give them your forecast, and that way you only have to order or keep 30 days of inventory. That would keep the footprint of your warehousing down. Or there are some manufacturers that can get it down to 2 weeks if they have a good supplier relationship. Second thing is the packaging and sales style. You need to collaborate on packaging so that it can withstand damage in transportation. And then, of course, procurement agreements. You know, which companies are you going to select to provide your goods? So again, continuous improvement, cost down, reduction in defects, and production output goals. We monitored at Honda our suppliers so closely. Whenever they had a defect rate of X%, Y%, or a warranty cost that exceeded X amount, those suppliers were required to come to our office and give a detailed explanation of why these things are happening and what they intend to do to fix it. Also, the distribution centers need to be efficient. Here's one that relies heavily on conveyors, where products are picked, put on conveyor belts, and in some cases, if they're in the right configuration, put on pallets and go right into a truck, zip, to the Toys R Us distribution center in Atlanta. I visited one time when I was going to Georgia Tech as a student. They had that kind of arrangement. It was magic. It was like you're in a train station with goods going past you. And then, of course, we have robotics. Now, very interesting that robotics have a very important role. What you see here in a manufacturing plant, an auto plant, is a bunch of welding robots. Now, there used to be at one time, excuse me, people doing this. But the benefit of a robot is they can replicate the task over and over and over again, not missing work, no sick days, no change in performance, as long as they're maintained. And what has happened is they have displaced a lot of jobs, but the people that make the robots or design the robots have created jobs. So again, there are different types of robots. You know, again, there are people, before I get into this over here, I want to mention these things, that nowadays, Japan is extensively invested in robot technology. And one of the things that they had over there was during COVID, they had robots sanitize restrooms and cafeterias and work areas. So there was no chance of anyone becoming infected. The second thing in Japan is they're having a declining population where the deaths exceed the births. People are living to be 90 years old in Japan, and young couples are not having children. In fact, the average, I believe, is below 1 per family, 1 child. So now they are heavily examining, you know, ways to use robots where jobs once were. In fact, many places are experimenting with baristas, such as you see in Starbucks, but these would be done automatically, consistently, without people missing work, with a cheery little robot. So it's very, very interesting what the role of robotics has become, and it's certainly something you might want to look into at some time. So the suppliers then basically would be working on warehouse design and location, storage and shipping, cost control, and damage prevention. And of course, the packaging initiatives are very important. At Honda, we had a whole department of packaging engineers. Give you an example. One of our plants was producing taillights for the Civic. It's a big taillight. And we were getting tremendous numbers of these things being sent back as damaged. That's because the packaging was poorly designed. And when it was stacked into a truck, it used to break one of the ears off the lens. So we had collaborated with our packaging engineers, and they came up with some robust packaging, so it completely stopped. The dealers were no longer angry with us, and our warranty returns were diminished. And then also certain things need to be returned. So for example, when you sold the transmission, a remanufactured transmission, we wanted the core, the old transmission back, so we could put that into the queue for further remanufacturing. So again, logistics are just not dropping something off. They could be picking up goods that might want to go to recyclers to increase revenue to a company or bring back cores. But the one thing you didn't want to do is send a truck full and then bring it back empty. So again, here's a look at some of these conveyors. Absolutely amazing. So now when we start to talk about trucks, things are called FTL or LTL. One is a full truckload and the other one is less than a truckload. When we work with suppliers, care and handling is important, the trucking company. We don't want them to damage anything. We want them to take optimal routes so they don't burn too much gas and that they have the capabilities for reverse logistics. Now, sometimes if you get a bad distribution center, this is the way they're packaging or actually putting their product into a trailer with inferior packaging. Well, I don't have to say how much damage was reported by dealers when this guy over here delivered those goods. They shift, fall on top of one another and damage goods that so many people work so hard to produce to a certain quality level. We literally declared war on these guys. And eventually the solution was to come up with cages. So these cages were the dimension that fit right into the trailer. We would fill them with the goods we wanted. And therefore, once they were in there, they were impervious to damage. And they came in various sizes so that we could completely fill all the different cubic feet that would be evident in a different trailer. Okay, so that's it for session number 2. And I want to say that there's a lot to talk about in that. So again, take notes. And when you show up for weekend number 4, I can address any of the things that you might have on your mind. Thanks again for watching, and now we'll be moving on to session number 3. So as you know, session number 3 was usually reserved for a lecture, and then of course our discussion about the readings. So this one, basically, I was going to devote to the Honda Supplier Conference that I mentioned earlier, where we spoke to all of our suppliers in mass production and also in service parts to pretty much stipulate what the requirements would be for the year ahead. So I plan to show you a Honda Supply Chain's transformative video that gives you an idea of how products made their way from globally from across the sea to the United States and what we did to put a hub inside Chino, California, along with the other hubs, that we had in Loudon, Tennessee, and over in Ohio. Now, when we talk about shipping items out of the country, one of the ways to simplify your global business is to work with a freight forwarder or a forwarding agent. And that's a person or a company that organizes shipments for individuals or corporation to get goods from the manufacturer or producer to a market, customer, or of course, a final point of distribution. In other words, is leave the driving to us. So with all of this, what is it that they do? These are things that they would handle. The commercial invoice, the packing list of the goods, the export shipping bill, the bill of lading, their certificate of origin, letter of credit if applicable, insurance certificates, or the declaration of hazardous cargo if applicable. Now, each of these things requires some explanation that we're not going to go into in this course, but the reason I wanted to show these to you is that it's very complicated and these are experts at it. And again, we'll be showing this video. There's another tool at your disposal, and that is a bond of warehouse. Here's a 1925 picture taken by the, actually it was taken by the newsman, very famous Damon Runyon, of a tobacco and wine warehouse back then, even though it mentions horses, hogs, and things like that. But it is a secure place to store items intended for export while you wait for a buyer, allowing you to delay the payment of customs duties and taxes. We had one of these down in Miami that we used to use at Honda because we would be shipping to Latin America and we would put them in there. And also you can do some repackaging and other things inside of those bonded warehouses without any kind of regulations to adhere to. So again, a lot of things in here, their capabilities. You can put the return of unsold goods without paying duty on them. Restricted items can be stored. They can be temperature controlled for perishables. And as I mentioned with this Latin American Caribbean initiative, businesses may store their goods closer to foreign customers. And the storage of goods for items that have not yet cleared through customs and more can be stored there. So this is a tool you have at your disposal. So in global business, if you're shipping, well, first you have to adhere to all the rules for the country you're shipping to and understand the tariffs, et cetera. But also these companies can do a lot to make life easier on you, a bonded warehouse, for example, or the freight forwarders. Now, I'm sure many of you don't know exactly that these things exist. Few people do. If you do, I'm impressed. But these are part of it. So in this lecture, we talked about tariffs, and we talked about ways to move product, and then tools that are at your disposal, and also emphasizing the risk associated with all the different aspects of the supply chain. So I had originally designed this last session for you to talk about supply chain management and get it out in the open and clarify some issues. And all of this with COVID and the global economy. So that's it for lecture number 3. And I hope you thoroughly enjoyed this. I think it's a good idea to not only have the classroom lecture, but as needed, we can do these as well. Okay, thanks a lot for watching, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in weekend number 4.